after acquisition or the completion of this particular transaction. Today we just want to spend a couple minutes talking about some of the trading dynamics, the arrangement overview, where we are in terms of the latest developments regarding the deal, and next steps for shareholders. So let's quickly recap the arrangement overview, and this would have been covered in a previous webinar, but we'll just go over it again. With respect to the offer, Sagicor is or has entered into an arrangement with Canadian Alinvest Acquisition 2 Corporation, and this deal involves old Sagicor or its existing Sagicor shares being delisted from the Trinidad and Tobago Stock Exchange, the Barbados Stock Exchange, and the London Stock Exchange also. Shareholders will receive some combination of cash and or shares in new Sagicor, currently known as AQY. With respect to AQY, it's going to acquire 100% of Sagicor's listed shares. The deemed exchange price for these shares is $1.75 US per share. The AQY, or the company AQY rather, will be renamed Sagicor Financial Company Limited, which we are referring to as New Sagicor, and it will be, of course, listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Who is Alinvest? Well, by now, everyone should be who owns Sagicor shares should be familiar, given the plethora of information that is available. It's a special purpose acquisition company, or SPAC. It's sponsored by an investment management company called Alinvest Management Corporation. It's already listed on the TSX in Canada, or the Toronto Stock Exchange, as AQY. And if you go onto Yahoo Finance, for example, and type in the symbol AQY, you can find the current share price, which is currently just around $9.45 to $9.50 Canadian per share. And at present, the only investment that's going to be housed within Alinvest or New Sagicor will be that of the operations of the existing company that is Sagicor. What will shareholders be receiving? And this is going to be sooner rather than later. Well, as you would have probably heard before, shareholders would be receiving for shares less than 10,000 and owned before December 6th, 2018, US $1.75 per share paid fully in cash if you so elected, and or shares in New Sagicor if you so chose. For shares that are greater than 10,000, you would be receiving US $1.75 per share paid in kind in the form of shares in New Sagicor. For any of those shares that you owned after December 6th, 2018, for all such shares, you would be receiving $1.75 per share paid in kind in the form of shares in New Sagicor. And a quick reminder to everyone, you can feel free to post your questions to the moderated chat throughout the presentation, and we will answer as many of these questions as possible at the end in our Q&A session. So please feel free to share those questions throughout the presentation. So of course, many shareholders are asking, how many New Sagicor shares will I get? And it's all dependent on the exchange ratio. And the exchange ratio is, as you can see on the on the screen in front of you, $1.75 divided by 10 multiplied by the Canadian to US dollar rate. And let's just go through a quick example of what that translates into. Well, if, for example, the closing exchange rate was US 0.76086 cents per Canadian dollar, using the exchange ratio formula, that would translate into an exchange ratio of 0.23 exactly, or 23 AQY shares or New Sagicor shares for every 100 of existing Sagicor shares validly tendered. Now, just some updates for viewers. The current FX rate as of June 25th this morning was 0.75988 per 1 Canadian dollar, and that implied exchange ratio was 0.2303. So pretty much in line with the example that we have shown. So, what are some of the latest developments? Well, since we last spoke back in February or March, a lot has taken place. Since then, on May the 23rd, AQI or Alinvest shareholders would have approved the transaction going through, and subsequently, Sagicor shareholders would have voted by proxy or in person on June 4th, 2019, so not so long ago, and would have almost unanimously approved the transaction as well, or that combination between Alinvest and Sagicor Financial Corporation. On June 11th, again, just about 2 weeks ago, on June 11th, just around 2 weeks ago, there was the deadline for submission of the election consideration form, and the results of this were rather surprising, and we'll speak a little bit more about this going forward. And on June 14th, just about 2 weeks ago as well, there was the approval granted by the Supreme Court of Bermuda, which takes us to today. And expected completion of this transaction is sometime in the late third quarter of 2019 or early fourth quarter of this year. So we spoke a little bit about the election consideration and its rather surprising results. What do we mean by that? Well, initially, Alinvest envisaged, based on the shareholding structure of Sagicor, that they would have, based on certain assumptions, to pay out a maximum of US $205 million to Sagicor shareholders who would have opted for an exit. The remaining Sagicor shareholders who would have rolled into shares of AQI or New Sagicor would be valued at around $333 million US, which left Alinvest or this newly formed entity with excess cash after expenses of just around $203 million US, which was already earmarked for certain acquisitions, which we'll talk about shortly. The results of the election consideration were quite surprising. As compared to that $205 million in expected cash payouts, only $20 million worth of Sagicor shareholders or Sagicor shares elected to receive cash, which means that the value of Sagicor shares that are going to be rolled into the new Sagicor company is actually around almost 200 million US greater than that 333 million spoken about, which is pretty much around 518 million US dollars. And that, based on the company's announcement recently, would leave New Sagicor, or EQI as it is currently known, with excess cash after expenses or expected expenses of just around $400 million US, almost $200 million more than it was going to expect to have at this point in time. Now, why is this important? Well, for Alinvest, one of the objectives as part of this deal was shrinking a disaggregated shareholder base. And what does that mean? Well, it means that as at the end of 2018, from Sagicor's annual report, Sagicor had just under 36,000 unique shareholders by number of persons or entities. The assumptions that Alinvest would have used in its acquisition initiatives would have shrunk that number from just under 36,000 to just about 3,600 or 3,600, and almost 90% decrease in the number of shareholders. And many of these shareholders would be fairly small shareholders with less than 10,000 shares. But the results of the actual election consideration, again, very surprising to most onlookers, was that just about 24,700 shareholders are going to remain. And this is based on certain estimates and assumptions by the Bourse team, which means that the number of shareholders would have shrunk by just around 30-odd%. Now, in terms of shareholder composition, that changes things significantly. Initially, it was envisaged that based on Alinvest assumptions, the non-Sagicor shareholders in blue would ultimately own just about 59% of New Sagicor and existing shareholders of Sagicor, who currently own Sagicor shares, who opted to stay in and get and receive new shares of Sagicor as opposed to cashing out, would own just around 41% of Sagicor, of the new Sagicor. With the results of the election consideration, this has in fact, based on our estimates, flipped quite significantly, or changed quite significantly, whereby non-Sagicor shareholders or shareholders of Alinvest will now own 49% or less than a controlling interest based on our estimates, that's Bourse's estimates, and existing shareholders of Sagicor will own just around 51% or slightly over, or just enough for a majority control of new Sagicor. Now this will all change based on vesting of certain founder shares, which is it's a second layer of complication in the transaction, whereby after the second founder vesting, and this is based on certain milestones being achieved, and those milestones are specifically that the book value of the company will increase by 20%, and the traded share price of new Sagicor will also increase by 20% within the first 5 years of its listing. And if that takes place, at that point in time, non-currently shareholders of Sagicor would own just around 51% of the company, and 49% would be held by the existing or old Sagicor shareholders. So certainly a very interesting development there in terms of the ownership structure of Alinvest. And it begs the question, with now just over 400 million in expected excess cash, which is 200 million more than was anticipated, what is this cash going to be used for? And of course, this excess cash is cash and cash commitments, which is cash on hand, as well as persons who have placed forward commitments to provide cash in the future. So some of the possible uses of this cash would be, well, firstly, to pursue additional acquisitions. Now, as investors of Sagicor and followers of the story may recall, Sagicor has entered into an arrangement with Scotia to purchase their Jamaican and Trinidad insurance operations for the price of just under $200 million US, and that's expected to add just around 30 million US per annum of earnings to the new Sagicor company. Now, it remains to be seen whether or not new Sagicor or AQY has additional acquisitions that it would have already lined up. If not, the acquisition or additional acquisitions will probably be more of a longer-term venture as opposed to a near-term venture. Another possible use of this 200 million in surprise cash, if you'd like to call it that, would be refinancing of debt. Sagicor currently has, in terms of its most famous outstanding debt, US $320 million of an 8.875% US dollar bond that is outstanding and matures in August 2022. However, this bond can be repaid early on its anniversary, and it's the next anniversary that's coming up, which corresponds to the first call date of the bond, is in August of this year, 2019. So it remains to be seen whether or not this excess cash will be put to use or can be put to use to refinance or even retire this part or all of this debt with this excess cash plus some of the cash resources possibly of Sagicor otherwise. And finally, one of the other considerations for the uses of the cash would be a stock buyback. If this 200 million was anticipated to be used, or 205 million rather, to pay out Sagicor shareholders, and only 20 million of it was used, would Alinvest, upon listing on the Toronto Stock Exchange, utilize some of these funds or all of these funds to repurchase shares from the open market? So certainly 3 very interesting opportunities or possible uses of this excess cash that was not foreseen based on certain assumptions by Alinvest and Sagicor in the initial configuration of this transaction. So what's next for shareholders? Well, the road is fairly simple from here. How are you going to receive cash if you were eligible for cash and so elected to receive? Well, cash consideration will be paid in the form of a check, and it will be mailed to the shareholder's address listed in the register of members within 7 days of the effective time. Lots of fairly fancy words there. Effective time simply refers to the point at which the transaction is deemed to have been completed, and specifically that is when a notice of, or when documents have been properly filed for the registration of the new company. Trading of old Sagicor shares, as you would know, even after this vote has taken place and the election consideration period has been completed and passed, shares continue to trade as usual on the Trinidad and Tobago Stock Exchange, as well as the Barbados Stock Exchange and the London Stock Exchange. So trading continues and should continue, or trading of Sagicor shares or old Sagicor shares should continue until the shares are suspended just prior to the effective time for the completion of this deal. After that, the shares of new Sagicor will be listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. In fact, as mentioned, the company AQY is already listed on the stock exchange, and it's just a matter of time before shareholders who would have elected to receive shares in new Sagicor will get their new shares and be able to trade them. So, how are you able to trade on the new Sagicor on the Toronto Stock Exchange? Well, details are still emerging from Sagicor and Alignvest on the actual process, but it should be fairly simple as follows. The first step, of course, is to open an international brokerage account with any of several providers locally. And Bourse Trader, of course, is certainly one of or should be your preferred account to open when thinking about trading your new Sagicor shares. Secondly, once as it is determined who is the custodian in the Canadian jurisdiction which will hold your shares, you would then have to instruct that custodian to transfer those new Sagicor shares to your international brokerage account or your Bourse Trader account. And once that is complete, you can be free to trade your shares of new Sagicor, and you can sell them, or you can even buy additional shares of new Sagicor should you so desire. What should you do with your Sagicor shares at this point? Well, much again has happened since we last spoke about this particular transaction. And if you still have your old Sagicor shares, and as mentioned, they are still trading on the Trinidad and Tobago Stock Exchange and Barbados Stock Exchange, you can either sell them or hold them, or you can even buy some more if you'd like. Now, if you would like, what would be some of the reasons that would drive you to sell these shares? Well, if you prefer to trade on the regional exchanges, if you have no particular desire or need for US dollars and or Canadian dollars, and if you have no desire to open an international trading account, well then selling on the current exchanges is probably the best option for you. Why would you hold your shares of old Sagicor? Well, if you want new Sagicor shares which are listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, that's probably the strongest or most compelling reason as to why you would be holding your shares of old Sagicor. And eventually, when you do receive your shares of new Sagicor, what would prompt you or encourage you to sell or hold your shares of new Sagicor? Well, on the sell side, if there is a very quick appreciation of the share price of new Sagicor on the Toronto Stock Exchange, it could incentivize one to take those gains and enjoy them. Secondly, if you wanted access to Canadian proceeds from the sale of your shares. And thirdly, if you are a residual shareholder of new Sagicor shares and you don't quite buy in to the promises or the direction of new Sagicor, or if it is the case that new Sagicor does not deliver on some of its promises, well then that will also incentivize you to sell. On the other side, holding, if you believe in the improved prospects of the company, if you are optimistic about the company's performance and some of its acquisitions, such as the Scotia insurance operations in Jamaica and Trinidad, if you are open to receiving a US dollar dividend from time to time, and if you want to have some measure of diversification by geography and or currency, well then holding new Sagicor shares is probably a very good option for you as well. Now, for those of us who have elected to receive cash, and that would be a maximum of $17,500 or your first 10,000 shares at $175 per share, plus eventually your proceeds from selling your Sagicor shares if you so choose. How can you invest your US dollars? Well, the great thing about investing in a hard currency is that there are many opportunities available. You can look at a range of income mutual funds, which are the lower risk end of the investing spectrum, as well as repurchase agreements, which beat bank rates and offer that element of low risk and principal preservation. If you'd like more of an income, but you also want to balance your risk, you could look at international bonds. And if you favor growth or capital growth over time, you can look at higher risk investments, but also potentially higher reward investments such as index, sector, country, or regional exchange traded funds, which are or have become quite popular among investors, as well as individual international stocks, which tend to be on the higher end of the risk spectrum. So that takes us to our Q&A session. We've had a couple questions throughout, but feel free, please, to send whatever questions you have our way if we haven't answered them throughout the presentation already, and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible now. Okay, question 1, how soon can I sell my new Sagicor shares? Okay, so this was addressed within the presentation. As soon as it's listed and your broker and your shares are transferred from the custodian to your brokerage account, which you would have opened or should have opened, you would be able to sell your Sagicor shares at that point. When exactly is the timing for this? Well, it all depends on when the transaction is officially completed. And again, that should be in the third quarter of this year. So you're talking probably September or so, or early fourth quarter. So let's say conservatively between September and December of this year. Second question, what if you did not indicate a desire to sell your shares and want to do so now? Well, just to be clear, the desire that you needed to indicate was whether or not you wanted to receive cash for your shares that you owned before December 6th, 2018, or to receive shares of new Sagicor. Now, if you have not done that, then your option remains one of two things. One, you can sell your shares on the open exchange right now, whether it be listed in Trinidad, London, or Barbados, or you can hold on to your shares until the transaction is completed and you receive new Sagicor shares, at which point you would receive new shares of new Sagicor. There's no option to receive cash, and you would have to then sell it through a brokerage account again at the point at which you are able to do so. Next question, do I have to open a Canadian brokerage account? Well, the answer is no. There will be a Canadian custodian, all of the things held constant, which will initially custody your shares. But to trade your shares, you would need to open an account with a local brokerage firm that does give access to trading international securities, and Bourse Trader, of course, does give you that ability to trade stocks, bonds, and ETFs across the globe. Okay, any more questions? When do we select? Okay, when do we select what we want to do, either take cash or take shares? Well, as mentioned, that was the election consideration date on June 11th, so that has unfortunately passed. And at this point, if you do own Sagicor shares, you will be defaulted to receiving new shares in new Sagicor. So there's no longer the option after June 11th to elect whether or not you want to receive cash or shares in Sagicor. Okay. Any additional questions? It seems that the presentation was fairly well articulated. Okay. Oh, there's another question. If you already have a brokerage account like E-Trade, can this be used? Certainly it can. The process, of course, of getting your shares from the Canadian custodian, whoever that eventually turns out to be, to your E-Trade account would be dependent on your relationship with E-Trade. But it should be fairly straightforward in terms of getting it across. You would just have to instruct the Canadian custodian to transfer it to your E-Trade account and give them your identification number or your account number and your name, for example. All right, another question. How do I go about opening an international account with Bourse if I currently have an account with Bourse? Well, it's fairly simple. You would have to just update your account with 2 forms of ID if it is now outdated. So if you recently opened a new account with Bourse, well, that should not be an issue, but you just fill out the account opening form for your international trading sub-account with Bourse. And all of that, of course, all of your holdings at Bourse are shown on a consolidated statement, which is available through our Bourse online trading or online investor access platform rather. So you can see all your holdings at any point in time from the comfort of your home without having to request any additional information. And this is, of course, a complimentary service of Bourse. Next question, what's the taxation on capital appreciation and dividend income? Okay, so this is an excellent question, and it was one that was posed to Sagicor on multiple occasions. And the answer is, according to Sagicor, based on their study and the fact that the company is domiciled in Bermuda and not Canada, and is tax resident in Barbados, that there should be no change in the tax treatment of dividend income and or capital gains. Okay, so I hope that has answered your question. Next question, can I open an international account with sterling or is it just USD? I think accommodations can be made by some providers, including Bourse Trader, for accepting sterling into your account, and from there you can easily convert it into any other major currency. Where can we get information on the fees and prices for Bourse's online trading or the Bourse Trader platform? Well, you can contact anyone at Bourse, check out our website, and we'll send you an FAQ which details all of these issues and more, or these characteristics and more of the Bourse Trader platform. What will be the starting value, next question, of new Sagicor shares on the Canadian exchange? So this is a great question. Well, as it currently stands, AQY, which is soon to be new Sagicor, is already traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange, and the trading price is, at last check, which was just before this presentation, around $9.45 Canadian per share. So a little bit below the initial or the official exchange price of $10 Canadian per share, but it's currently listed at or trading at $9.45 per share. Okay, we leave it open for 2 more minutes perhaps for any additional questions. And okay. So it seems that there are no additional questions on the Sagicor transaction with Alignvest and life after acquisition. Oh, there's another question. What will the exchange ratio be? So perhaps somebody who joined in late, but the exchange ratio, just to cover it again, let me just pull it up here very quickly. The exchange ratio is 1.75 divided by 10 multiplied by the US dollar to Canadian exchange rate. And in this particular example, that exchange ratio worked out to be 0.23. Now, the exchange ratio will only be determined just immediately prior to the effective time taking place, and that time is still unknown. It all depends on when the final approvals and applications for registration are undertaken by new Sagicor. Can you show what happens when you, or next question, can you show what happens when you get paid in cash again? So just, okay, so let's, if we could ask the viewer to be a little bit more specific in terms of cash, that particular question. If you are going to get paid, well, when you get paid in cash, it all depends on how many and how much cash you get paid, all depends on what your holdings of Sagicor are. And let me just pull up that slide very quickly. If you own shares on or before December 6th, 2018, for shares which number 10,000 or less, you would receive US $1.75 per share paid fully in cash if you so elected, and that is you would have had to submit a valid consideration election or election consideration form before June 11th, 2018, with that date which has now passed, and or you could opt for shares in shares of AQI. Okay, I see the viewer has provided some clarification, so let me just get to that. And that is, what are you going to receive? All right, so what will I receive in cash? That is, you will receive a cash consideration that will be paid in the form of a check for the cash part of your transaction. It will be mailed to shareholders' addresses listed on the register of members, and it's going to take place within 7 days, or it's going to be mailed out within 7 days of the effective time. Okay, next question. Will we have to provide Canadian currency if we wish to purchase new AQI shares? You can, well, you would have to provide a hard currency, so it would have to be something that's convertible into Canadian. So for example, if you had US dollars or even sterling or Great British pounds, you can use that to move into Canadian dollars and ultimately purchase your shares of new Sagicor. Next question, when will be the effective time? So as mentioned, the effective time is as yet unknown. It all depends on when Sagicor and Aligninvest receive all of their final approvals and are then able to register the company successfully and of course fully legally in Bermuda. Okay, so 1 more minute perhaps for any additional questions. It seems as though everyone has. Oh, will there be an option to reinvest? Okay, a follow-up question to the effective time. Any idea of when that will be? And as we said, it's difficult to estimate. However, the guidance given by Sagicor is sometime in late 3rd quarter of 2019 or early 4th quarter of 2019. Just to be conservative, I would say don't expect this to occur until possibly the end of this year, and that's because regulatory approvals sometimes take longer than expected. Can we access this presentation later? Of course you can. It will be posted on YouTube, and you can of course check out the Bourse website for a full replay of the presentation. And there will there be an option to reinvest dividend income? That is something that we will need to explore a bit further, but that's a question that we will answer in an FAQ sheet that we typically generate after these webinar presentations. So we have everyone's email, and we'll email that the list of questions that were asked as well as their responses to our entire viewership base within this week. Okay, one more time, the calculation for new shares, someone asked about that again, so let's just go over that one more time. And that is the exchange ratio. How many new Sagicor shares will you get? It all depends on the exchange ratio, and that exchange ratio is 1.75 divided by 10 multiplied by the Canadian to US dollar rate. And if we take it one step further into a numerical example, if we assume that the closing exchange rate as at the effective time was 0.76 or 76.086 cents per Canadian dollar, the exchange ratio would work out exactly in this example to 0.23, which means for every 100 shares of Sagicor that you own, you would receive 23 shares of Align-Vest or new Sagicor shares. I hope that answers the question of the exchange ratio, which is admittedly a fairly ticklish subject. All right, so any last questions at this point? If not, we are going to collate all of these questions that were asked and answer them in an FAQ, which we will email to all of those viewers who did tune in to the presentation, and we'll also post it on our website for easy access. And a reminder again, if you missed some part of the presentation, we know everyone is busy. You can check out the replay. It's going to be posted on YouTube, and you can, of course, access it on our website at www.bourseinvestment.com. So I think that's it for today. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to tune in and learn a little bit more about Sagicor Financial Corporation and life after this acquisition. And if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to members of the Bourse team by email or call in, and we'll be more than happy to answer any of your questions and provide clarifications to the best of our ability. So until our next webinar series, thanks for tuning in and see you next time.